Good afternoon. My name is Jason Lim, and I'm the Identity Management Capability Manager for the Transportation Security Administration, TSA, which is a component of the U.S. government's Department of Homeland Security. So as the Identity Management Capability Manager, which is a mouthful, my job is to develop and drive a cohesive and consistent strategy to ensure that all identity management activities are pulling in the same direction in order to enhance mission capability for TSA. So thank you for this opportunity to brief you on the status of digital identity strategy today. For this session, I'd like to walk you through how we are using the emerging mobile driver's license ecosystem to inform TSA's overall digital identity strategy. So slide 2. Before we get started with the actual digital identity strategy, I'd like to set the context by explaining TSA's footprint in the identity space in aviation security. So as an experienced traveler, I'm sure you know that the first time you physically encounter TSA at an airport is when you have to hand over your physical ID to the Transportation Security Officer, the TSO, right? Standing at a podium. This position is called the Travel Document Checker position, TDC as we call it. Several things happen here when you hand over your ID. One, the officer examines the ID and determines whether it's authentic or not. Make sure it's a legitimate ID, not a fake ID. Two, the officer compares your face against a photo on the ID to determine that you look the same. Three, by scanning your boarding pass, the officer can tell that you have a flight out of that airport on that day, basically determine your right to be there. Four, the officer will check for your secure flight vetting status, which determines your risk to transportation security. And at the checkpoint, this is usually designated as either your pre-check, a standard, or a selectee. And depending on your risk status, you get different levels of physical screening. And depending on all these steps, the officer will direct you to the correct screening lane to get the appropriate level of physical screening. This used to happen on average about 2.5 million to 3 million times a day, making TSA the largest consumer of identity in the US in a offline ID verification case, which this is, right? So currently the IDs are mostly driver's license and passports, plus other kind of miscellaneous IDs for trusted travelers, global entry, travel IDs, whatnot. But what we can't do today at TSA checkpoint is to accept an MDL or a mobile digital identity and go through the same identity management security process that I've just explained and outlined above. And we know that mobile driver's licenses, right, MDL is coming. And other forms of mobile digital identity is also coming. In fact, it's here already, right? In 2 states, in Louisiana and Colorado, where they have been issuing MDLs to their citizens for use within their respective state boundaries. So moving on to the next slide, slide 3. So this shows the kind of a overview of how we are approaching digital mobile identity. You know, the key takeaway from this slide that I want to get across is that an MDL is a subset of the larger digital identity. However, it is probably the most important form of digital identity, especially in TSA space, right? That is expected to be adopted by up to 50% of the US driving population within 10 years. And this is a prediction that's probably too conservative in light of the pandemic and the general kind of societal drive towards a touchless experience for everything. And in addition to the need for the touchless experience, another trend that's driving the adoption of MDL and digital identity is the kind of general ascendancy of the concept of self-sovereign identity, SSI, which is really all about privacy and cybersecurity. SSI is an identity ecosystem in which the users can fully control their credentials without the need for a centralized authority or database, and can exercise granular control over who and what an entity can access their identity information. In digital identity, MDL satisfy both the touchless aspect and the self-sovereign identity needs while being more secure against potential fraud and imposter risk. So moving on to slide 4. If we had to summarize this whole deck into one sentence, it's really the one to the right. The first bullet point and the last box to the right. The TSA is taking a standards-based approach to our exploration of digital identity and credentials. And by this, we mean that we are going to identify the specific identity management touchpoints that's relevant to digital identity and set requirements on how that technology can interact with TSA at the checkpoint based on the prevailing authoritative and open standard in order to ensure interoperability, level playing field in the industry, and drive innovation. Going on to next slide. These are the functional areas, right, that we are investigating in order to make MDL and digital identity work in TSA security mission space. So obviously, these are very familiar, and I'd have to call out each one of these out separately. But equities in all these functional areas have to be satisfied in order for MDL to become an acceptable form of ID at the checkpoint. Therefore, we are very encouraged to see an ecosystem of standards that are emerging around MDL that can actually address these functional equities and allow for interoperability across different players via open standards. And that's key for us. Slide 6 kind of shows you how these standards may fit, right? And what are the aspects of these functional areas that can be addressed by these emerging standards. So for this slide, this is what we call the framework of the triangle of trust ecosystem for a digital identity. This explains how the key players are bound together via open standards to create trust in the digital identity. And number one, you have the issuing authority, like the Department of Motor Vehicles of individual states, or other government entities like Department of State, or even non-government entities, right? Or even private enrollment services. So any company can essentially become an issuing authority for digital identity, which they largely do today, right? Large companies, that are represented in this forum, basically, they issue their own employee credential, for example. And number two, you have the user, right, who owns the mobile device and where the issued digital credential lives. So the issuing authority has to provision the mobile device with that digital identity. And number three, you have the relying party, which TSA is one, and anyone else who needs to verify an individual identity information for access, benefits, for whatever purpose. A bank or liquor stores are other examples that are often cited, although they each have different needs for different types of information. So the next slide is probably the most technical of the slides in this deck today. In this slide, we are layering over the names of the emerging applicable standards over the triangle of trust framework. If we go around the triangle, with step A, we see that the issuing authority can leverage either NIST 863A or Real ID regs, in case of driver's licenses, to proof the individual for an underlying identity that can be trusted. And step B describes how the issuing authority will provision the individual's mobile device with a digital identity in a trusted and secure way that cannot be manipulated. The ISO standard that's meant to govern this leg of the triangle isn't complete yet, it just got started. In fact, the working group of which TSA is a voting member just started up last year. Our final draft on this standard, the 23220, probably won't be completed for another few years, but the formal work has been started in the ISO. However, there are certain emerging best practices that major players are self-complying with already, and that's going to make their way into the eventual standard. Step C is where TSA has the most equity since it governs the way that MDL information is transmitted to our device, which we call CAT, and the MDL dongle we're actually developing right now to consume this digital identity information. Step D also contains TSA equity because it goes to how TSA can authenticate that the MDL is legitimate by using the public key, distributed by the issuing authority, in this case, the state's DMV. So moving on to the next slide. So imagine if you're the passenger, right? If you're using an MDL to get through our checkpoint, this is how the process would look like from the passenger experience perspective. And as you go through, please note the make flight reservation touch point. I just want to take a little sidebar on this. If we can create a system whereby an MDL holder can make a flight reservation from your smartphone or tablet using his or her MDL, it will really give TSA absolute assurance that the person who's making the reservation is the person that we are vetting, is also the person that will show up at our checkpoint. So this would introduce a much more rigor in terms of identity management from reservation to the checkpoint. So there's a lot of other use cases besides the ID verification just at the checkpoint for us. Then what happens when you get to the checkpoint is exactly as you would expect to happen at the checkpoint through a, either like a Apple Pay or Samsung Wallet type of maneuver. You tap, wave, your ID is authenticated, and your live face is matched against the photo and the ID on the digital photo that's passed to us, so the verification happens. Basically, you will present your MDL to the TSA device, right? As I mentioned, the dongle, the MDL dongle or reader that we're developing, that would ingest the needed information and name, date of birth, gender, and the digital photo for TSA and process it through our back-end security system as we do with any other physical credential, right? So the process really doesn't change that much from the user experience perspective, except instead of scanning your own physical ID, what you're doing, you're just tapping your mobile device against our reader and passing the digital ID information to us in a secure way. So moving on to slide 9. So this slide is a close-up of what happens when an MDL holder interacts with that device that you see, which we call a credential authentication technology device, a CAT2 device with the MDL dongle. Basically, as I just explained, you would present the MDL on your smartphone device and transmit the license information to TSA using the dongle. TSA would then use the public key, right, to authenticate the MDL information as having been issued by the issuing authority. We would then do a one-to-one facial matching to ensure that your live face matches the digital photograph on the MDL that you just passed to us, and ensure that the mobile device they're using to pass the MDL information to us is actually tied to your person. Then we will match your identity up to the corresponding transportation vetting status and confirm that you are either pre-check, standard, or selectee. Based on that, you go through to your appropriate physical screening lane as guided by the officer. So that's, in a sense, exactly what happens granularly to the behavior that needs to happen, exchange that needs to happen at the checkpoint between the passengers, MDL, the device, and also our reader. Slide 10, I threw in this slide in there because I just wanted to show you a rough list. It's not comprehensive of all the key stakeholders involved, right? We wanted to insert this slide to show this audience the extent of the stakeholder landscape and the different flavors of equities they each represent across the government, global organization, and industries. As you can see, the landscape is quite varied and large. And we really view the MDL and the digital identity that leverages the emerging MDL standards ecosystem to be a potential positive disruptor in the identity management space in the very near future. And this is the concluding slide, right? For TSA, none of our innovation or new capabilities happen in a vacuum. TSA touches 2.5 to 3 million passengers a day pre-COVID. So there's a heavy element of public interaction to the mission that TSA performs every day. And to do that, there has to be an extensive stakeholder engagement and collaboration that is always ongoing and happens in a very close way. In fact, we have R&D agreements with various industry partners in the MDL space to help ensure that TSA will be ready for MDLs or digital identities when they start showing up at our checkpoint. And obviously, it looks like there is an international component to the MDL and digital identity capability with the work that ICAO has been leading up with our State Department in the digital travel credentials, right, DTC, which is kind of complementary leg of the overall digital identity management kind of framework, with the addition of passports, then plus the driver's license, at least for TSA. So moving forward, I think we have a good footing to a start of a strategy in which we want to leverage open standards in order to make sure that all the different flavors of MDL digital identity that show up at the checkpoint can be consumed by TSA, can be validated, authenticated, and trusted in a secure way by leveraging kind of the common framework to do that communication. So in essence, that's the kind of the core of our digital identity strategy. There we're pushing forward and probably have something as pilot, as kind of a large interoperability testing kind of event in the very near future, working with key stakeholders to make this happen at the checkpoint in a kind of iterative way, right? So at that point, that concludes my presentation. And once again, I would like to thank you for this opportunity to speak to this audience, especially audience in South Korea, with all the different kind of international representation, especially with several very recognizable names in the identity management security space. So it has been a great honor to be able to share the same virtual stage with the rest of the presenters here today. So thank you for this opportunity to speak, and look forward to engaging with members of this audience further in the future. Thank you.